Hello, and welcome to a special episode of the Reykjavik Newsdesk. I'm Andie Sophia Fontaine. The topic of this video, as you were probably able to guess from the title, is Iceland's history is probably stranger than you think. Now, my single topic videos are decided by my patrons. It's one of the perks you can get by signing up for my Patreon, the link to which is in the description below, so when you get a chance, definitely check that out. So without further ado, let's get into Iceland's history. The discovery of the island itself was entirely accidental. Medieval Icelandic historians record that Irish or possibly Scottish Christians were possibly the first people to settle in Iceland. I say possibly because these historical accounts were written a long time after the fact, and these accounts differ in terms of how things played out. For example, some say that by the time the Norse got here, the monks or hermits or missionaries were already gone, but they left behind things like bells and cookingware and what have you. However, no modern archaeologists have found traces of these supposed early Christian settlers. Other accounts say that the Norse got here and the monks or hermits or Christian missionaries were already here, and that they simply chose to leave because they couldn't bear to live with pagans. And if they were missionaries, that would be kind of strange. But on the other hand, it's not like medieval Icelandic historians were ever shy to say, oh yeah, they totally slaughtered these people. So maybe that's true. Who knows? What we do know is that the first person recorded to have found Iceland was a Norse Viking named Nadod. Now, Nadod was not setting sail to explore new lands and find new things out there across the vast ocean. Rather, he was on his way to the Faroe Islands and got lost. He ended up in East Iceland, probably in a place that's now known as Reyðarfjörður, and hung out there for a little while, figured out there were no people, and decided to get back on his boat and go home. On his way, it began snowing, and so he decided to name the place Snæland, or Snowland. This is going to be a recurring theme in the naming of Iceland, by the way. Side note, but a Swedish Viking by the name of Garðr Sverrisson also accidentally found Iceland, in this case by being blown off course by a storm. He circumnavigated the island before briefly settling in the north and then deciding to go back home as well. And he modestly named the island after himself, Garðarsholmi, or Garðars Islet, as it were. Not much is known about Garðr after this point, but we'll get back to him later because he has a very interesting connection to this country that will appear much later on. The first recorded person to deliberately set sail for Iceland was another Norse Viking by the name of Hrafnafloki Vilgerðarson. He was so named because at one point in his journey after passing the Faroe Islands, he released some ravens as a means of trying to navigate his way to Iceland. And the one that flew to the northwest and didn't come back, he decided that bird's probably on its way to Iceland. And so although he didn't call it Iceland, of course, and he decided to follow that bird. He probably ended up setting up camp in the southern shores of the Westfjords, and he had a really rough time of it that winter. He was not really prepared for Icelandic winters in the Westfjords, which can be pretty brutal, to be honest. But when spring came, he, it is said, ascended a mountain and overlooked a fjord, probably Ísafjörður, which was just packed with chunks of ice floating around. And he's the one who decided to name the country Iceland, or Iceland. Funny enough, when he got back to Norway and people asked him about his amazing journey, his assessment was that this country was completely worthless and not worth settling in at all, which is kind of funny considering how things turned out. But incidentally, word had gotten out that there was this big uninhabited country that was just ripe for the taking, and that got the ball rolling for the settlement. The first recorded, deliberate, and permanent settler of Iceland is a name you might know, Ingólfur Árnason. You can see his statue on top of a hill in downtown Reykjavik, and he was not a very nice man, okay? The reason why he left for Iceland in the first place is because he had gotten embroiled in a blood feud. He set sail to Iceland with his blood brother, Hjörleifur Hróðmarsson, and a bunch of slaves. Yes, slaves, Irish slaves. A lot of these Irish slaves, owned by Hjörleifur anyway, had an uprising and killed Hjörleifur and then escaped. And Ingólfur tracked them down one by one and murdered them in the Westman Islands, so named because that's what the Norse used to call the Irish, Westmen. Now, the legend goes that Ingolf decided where to permanently settle by having his high seat pillars thrown overboard. Now, the high seat is the chair that the head of the household sits in, and it's adorned with these pillars. And he had his slaves throw the pillars overboard and declared, wherever the pillars wash up, that's where the gods have decided I'm going to settle, and that's where I'll settle. And the legend says that it took 3 years to find where these pillars ended up washing up. Well, this legend is maybe kind of probably not true, but it is a very romantic tale, and so it's been told very often. Now, we don't know much about what happened to Ingolfur after this point, but do you remember Garður that I mentioned earlier? It turns out that Ingolfur might not have been the first permanent settler of Iceland after all, because one of the passengers on Garður's boat was a guy with the very cool name of Nautfari, which, by the way, is also the name of a bird species. And when Garður was going on his way home, it's recorded that he witnessed a boat containing Nautfari and a slave and a bondwoman kind of drifting away from the ship. And they ended up settling in North Iceland, like right across from Húsavík. So Nautfari may have the distinction of being the first permanent settler in Iceland anyway. In conclusion, the discovery and settlement of Iceland is shrouded in mystery, accidents, and naming things after the first thing that people saw. After people began to permanently settle in Iceland, it wasn't long before more people followed, and soon there were little communities dotting all along the coast. And these communities were typically led by a chieftain. And these communities would manage their own affairs, but once a year, all the chieftains and other folks would get together for a national assembly, or Alþingi, wherein they would settle legal disputes, they would engage in trade deals, and have duels and marriages and all kinds of like very big important events. This period in Iceland's history, roughly the 9th to the 13th century, is called the Commonwealth. And if you spend too much time online, you might run into right-wing libertarian types who kind of laud this period in Iceland's history as this wonderful time of decentralized government where laissez-faire commerce ruled the day and everyone settled their disputes peacefully and everyone prospered. Well, the truth of the matter was quite different. In fact, it was not a very prosperous time for everybody. There was a few people who got very wealthy, sure, but most people were not. Slavery was still very much a thing, and it was not very peaceful. There were duels, there were blood feuds, and a few wealthy individuals began to see the opportunities being presented by this chaotic period, but we'll get to that later on. Christianity began to become ascendant in Iceland in the 10th century, and they often clashed with the pagans who were living there, and things got really, really bad, where it looked like the whole country was going to fall apart into civil war. And so at one Alþingi, they decided, you know what, we're going to make Christianity the religion of the land. But if you're pagan, you can practice it in private. And this sensible compromise was reached in the year 1000. But that wasn't the end of the chaos, not by a long shot. Through the 11th and 12th centuries, as more and more wealth became concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, there were a few very wealthy, very powerful families that began vying for power and control. And this period is known as the Age of Sturlungs, which is a reference to one of the families who were involved in this conflict. Things went from bad to worse for a really long time until the Norwegian king, Hákon IV, decided that he needed to get involved. And finally, in the year 1264, Iceland agreed to become a part of the Kingdom of Norway. For the next 700 years, Iceland was under either Norwegian or the Danish crown. Under Norway, a feudal system began to develop wherein everyone who didn't own land had to work for someone who did. Chieftains were replaced by Christian bishops. And then things got worse. When Olaf II of Denmark died in the year 1380, the Norwegian royal bloodline sort of fizzled out, and Iceland was brought under the wing of Denmark under the auspices of the Kalmar Union. Now, to this day, you will find Icelanders who have let's say, mixed feelings about Denmark. Danish is still taught in primary schools. A lot of Icelanders go to Denmark to study or even to find work or move permanently for that matter. So there is like kind of an affection for Denmark as a country in the 21st century. But there's no denying that way back then, in the Middle Ages, Denmark was not really nice to Iceland. While demanding absolute loyalty, Denmark did very little to help Iceland prosper. In fact, they actively worked against it. Now, the Danes had very little use for Iceland's wool and fish, which were its main exports, but the British and the Germans sure did, and they engaged in a lot of trade with Iceland. And Denmark, for whatever reason, didn't like this, and they imposed a trade monopoly on Iceland in the 17th century, so that they could only trade with Denmark. Nonetheless, illicit trade between Iceland and other countries did continue after this point, in particular France and the Netherlands. Denmark also did very little to protect Iceland, and one famous example of this is when Barbary pirates raided the south coast of Iceland in 1627. There's also evidence, as I discussed in a previous video, that Denmark deliberately withheld aid to Iceland following the devastating eruption of the volcano Laki in 1783. As you might imagine, centuries of negligence, selfishness, and sometimes outright cruelty did not exactly endear new generations of Icelanders to the Danish monarchy, and so an independence movement began to grow. By the 1800s, there was a nascent independence movement in Iceland, interestingly enough, led by Danish-educated Icelandic intellectuals. Romanticism and nationalism were kind of the fashion at the time across Europe, and so conditions were definitely very ripe for an independence movement to begin to flourish in Iceland. Jón Sigurðsson is the most famous leader of the independence movement in Iceland. He's kind of a national hero. Well, he very much is a national hero, not kind of a national hero. But the independence movement did not begin nor end with him, and in fact, the steps towards independence would take nearly a century. The first material step was arguably the reestablishment of Alþingi in 1843. Now, this was a consultative assembly, but it claimed a direct lineage from the national assemblies of ages past. In 1874, Denmark granted home rule to Iceland, and with it, a constitution. Fun side note about this constitution is almost identical to the same constitution that Iceland still uses today. Now, yes, we did have a National Assembly of our own in 2010, that you probably remember from after the protests, where the Icelanders got together and crowdsourced a new constitution. And yes, a lot of us did take part in writing this new constitution and creating a draft for a brand new constitution. But it's kind of lingered in a drawer somewhere ever since then, and this is a very sore subject to a lot of us, and it's still a very divisive issue to this day, our new constitution, wherever it is. Anyway, there were some tweaks made to this constitution through the 1900s, culminating in the biggest step towards independence in 1918, home rule, with the establishment of what was called the Kingdom of Iceland. The establishment of home rule is still celebrated to this day on its anniversary, December 1st, and it essentially granted Iceland full independence, except that Iceland would still nominally be under the Danish crown, and Denmark would take care of Iceland's defense and foreign relations. Now, this got the sovereignty ball rolling, as it were, to the point where in 1944, it started looking like now the time is right to just completely cut all ties with Denmark, politically speaking anyway, and form our own country. And so on May 24th, 1944, Icelanders voted in a 4-day plebiscite to decide whether or not to completely separate from the crown and establish the Republic of Iceland. 97% voted in favor. Makes you wonder what the other 3% were thinking. But this was formally established on June 17th, which is still celebrated as Iceland's Independence Day to this day, and it is a big old holiday. And that's when the Republic of Iceland, the fully independent nation, was finally born. From this point, Iceland began to find its place on the world stage. One of the most important steps in this was in 1949, when Iceland formally joined NATO. Well, the Icelandic government decided that Iceland was joining NATO. That is, there are in fact riots between pro and anti-NATO forces in Iceland over this very question. Mind you, this was after the British and then the Americans occupied Iceland during World War II. And so there were a lot of, mixed feelings about those countries in particular and NATO in general following the end of the war. The people in power in Iceland were also very keen on keeping the Soviet Union at bay so they could hang on to their wealth, and so joining NATO seemed like a really good option to them. From this point, Iceland began to steer its economy more and more into laissez-faire territory, especially when it came to the fish trade, which made a number of families very, very wealthy. So important was the fish trade, in fact, that Iceland got involved in a series of conflicts with the British Navy, which began in the 1950s and went through the 1970s. These conflicts were known as the Cod Wars, and for people who were around at the time, contemporary accounts from that time talk about, plucky little Iceland, which doesn't even have a military, standing up to the British Navy, and that, apparently endeared a lot of people to Iceland and made the British look like bullies. But amazingly, it wasn't until Iceland threatened to close down the NATO base in Keflavik and just withdraw from NATO altogether that they finally were able to put an end to this conflict. Icelandic politicians, in particular the conservatives, also led a drive of privatization on the domestic front as well through the 80s and the 90s, culminating in the privatization of the banks in the late 90s and early 2000s. This in itself culminated in the total collapse of the Icelandic economy. Since then, tension between privatization and public ownership is probably the main economic tension in this country, I would say. There are forces who want to continue to privatize everything, and there are forces who want to retain public ownership of things, or even take public ownership of things. And this remains the biggest conflict on the economic front and is still a significant political tension as well. You may meet some people who will contend that Iceland never grew past its system of clans and chieftains and serfs. And sure, there may be some truth to that. There are a few very wealthy families, there's a few very powerful individuals who guide policy at the expense of everybody else. However, there is no denying the fact that when you compare where Iceland started and where it is now, in this very short span of time, at least on a European scale, it's pretty remarkable what this country has done. For everything that this country has had to face over the centuries, the fact that this country has been able to get to where it is today is kind of miraculous when you think about it. But for me personally, I find Icelandic history very inspiring, and it makes me feel very, very lucky to live in this country. My only hope is that we can build a future for our country that is even better than any sort of event that has transpired in Iceland's past. But I suppose that's up to us. In any event, that's it for this special edition of Reykjavik Newsdesk. If you like the content that you see here, be sure and like and subscribe. And if you really like the content that you see here, check out the Patreon link in the description below to see what kind of goodies you can get just by kicking a little extra coin our way. Which reminds me, I want to thank Corinne Vasquez, Marianne Ward, Christopher Hunter, Marion Moores, Kimberly McDaniel, and Iceman98 for being patrons on the $20 level, Laura Johnson for being a patron on the $15 level, and Stephen Ellis and Viva Carvalho Schaffner for being patrons on the $10 level. You folks rock. That's all from me. Be good to each other.